Greetings and God bless. Welcome to another episode of Pastor Mike, Dynamic Voices for a Diverse Church, powered by The Witness, a Black Christian collective. I'm your host, Tyler Burns. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at BurnsClan. Please follow at your own risk. And joining me, as always, to my left is the founder of The Witness, very extensive bio, the man, the myth, the legend, the two-time best-selling author, Mr. Blue Check Verified himself, Dr. Jamar Tisby. Jay, we got a heavy one today.
A heavy one today. We're matching today.
We're matching.
On purpose.
In at least the general attire and color.
Right.
Black hoodies for a reason, because 10 years ago, February 26, 2012, was the death and the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman in Sanford, Florida. And we're today going to reflect upon what this date meant for us, what maybe it didn't mean at the time that it means now, and what this has meant for the broader Black Christian movement and movements for justice over the past 10 years. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years, Jeff.
10 years, bro. A decade.
10 years.
I was, as a historian, I'm always like, okay, what anniversaries are coming up related to Black history and whatnot? And I can't remember how exactly I got on it, but I started thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. And then, of course, I began thinking about Trayvon Martin, a kid. All right. Yeah. He's 17 years old. And I was like, let me look this up because this might be 10 years. And then sure enough, February 26, 2022 is 10 years. And when I think back on where I was, I want to hear where you were. It like that season of life, not like absolutely. When I heard I was right here. I want to. So at that point, I was in my second semester of seminary. Mm-hmm. We had this organization called the Reformed African American Network at the point.
Right.
It was just a Facebook page, and it had literally started just like 3-4 months before. So it was brand new. I was in a new city at a church that was intentionally multiracial, Black pastor. And I was like all in on this racial reconciliation stuff.
Yeah.
And I was convinced at that point that now was the time. Now was a moment where we were going to see some type of breakthrough. I didn't know what it was going to be per se, but I just felt like we had this moment to really push forward the cause of racial reconciliation in a new way. So we'll talk more about like reactions when we found out about this, but like what season of life were you in at that point?
Yeah, that was my second year or so of being a youth pastor in Florida, actually third year, just entering into it, of being a youth pastor in Florida. And in this stage of life where as a 23, 24-year-old, trying to find my own identity. And I remember how much of my Blackness was hidden from me at that point.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
And how much of even going to a Black church, I resisted the full embrace of my Black self and the people around me who I loved, their Black selves, and my Black church in its fullness. And so in the midst of all of that, I remember how Trayvon hit me, and I remember it not hitting me the same way as everyone else. And my reaction and response was very poor, and something I look back on now with shame.
Right.
But, I remember how much of that reform space shaped how I even viewed myself in that season, how I even viewed a young Black man who was an image bearer that I didn't even know, but I could see him in my youth group every single week. And I could not make that connection at that time, but that's where I was in the stage of life for sure.
And I think that's what was striking nationally. Because remember, like, this is kind of just at the cusp of when Twitter is starting to take off.
Yes. So Twitter was kind of that moment, probably 2010, 2011, where once you were on it, once you got on it, you were in it.
Yeah.
And you didn't understand it at first. And then you got in it. And once you figured it out, you were all in it. You were inundated with it.
I remember I would like quote myself and then tag myself on Twitter. I was be like, by at Jamar Tisby, and my friends were like, no, man, you don't need to, it's from your Anyway, it was that new.
That's hilarious. But no, it was that new, and it was that pop, and that was the first time I think we experienced a cultural moment
together
on Twitter. And obviously there was Facebook, which was super popular, the most popular medium at that time. But Twitter was also in that. And I think what I found was how, you know, to borrow phrases that writers have used, how beautiful and terrible Twitter is.
Mm-hmm.
That it was beautiful for drawing attention to perspectives that I did not know and people that needed to be illuminated. And it was also terrible for what they said about that young man.
Yes.
What they said about that image bearer.
That's what it was.
And then what they subsequently said about all the young men and women who have been killed at the hands of either the state or white supremacist vigilantes.
So I've heard multiple people in recent times refer to this season that we're in politically, socially, culturally as an apocalypse in the classic sense of the term, which means a revelation or a revealing. Yeah. And I think Trayvon Martin was a sort of a beginning of that apocalypse, that revealing, in the sense of, because of social media a lot of times, but also blog comments and various media, you got to see what people really thought. And for me, so this is an epochal moment. A lot of people have compared Trayvon Martin's killing to Emmett Till's lynching. Mm-hmm. And I struggle with that because we actually have multiple moments, unfortunately, where we can make that parallel. But I will say the murder of Trayvon Martin stands out because it was a year later, when his killer was acquitted, that the Black Lives Matter phrase became a cultural touch point for the continuation and this wave of the Black freedom struggle.
Yeah. How did that come about? Because I think it's important for us to constantly recount that story and make that a part of common Black knowledge.
Right. Well, first of all, 3 Black women, right? Mm-hmm. So we were all waiting with bated breath, right? Which is one of the hallmarks of the Black community in this country. When we experience injustice, we wait and we hope for the legal system to do what it's supposed to do.
Right.
And so, which is incredible patience, right? Considering what we're going through. And then the verdict came back. This man was not guilty under stand your ground laws.
Right.
Because he said he felt threatened. And then, and mind you, Trayvon's unarmed, he's armed, all that stuff.
And Zimmerman pursued him.
Yeah, he pursued him, hunted him down. So when the verdict came back on Facebook, one of the women wrote, she called it a love letter to Black people.
Yeah.
And she was basically just affirming our humanity.
It was Patrice, right? Patrice Cullors?
Yeah, I think so. And she said, our lives matter.
Yeah.
And then one of her friends, compatriots, picked it up and said, Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
And that was a thing that caught on. And it became this banner for the movement that in many ways we're still in now.
Yes.
And that was all traced back to Trayvon Martin. So that's a really, his death in particular is an incredibly important cultural moment, historical moment, this confluence of social media, of this is Obama's first term as president. So we are still, as a nation,
into the re-election season.
Right. So,
and him even saying he could be my son.
And that was like so controversial to some
how
people.
How controversial that was, and how that became a thing.
It makes me sick, bro.
That was an issue. That very basic statement became a
he couldn't say the least little thing. And like it was a surprise to people that we as Black people can see ourselves in Trayvon. Right. That Black women felt the burden. My wife, when we were coming down here to record this podcast, she reminded me, but your tags are expired.
Yeah.
And she was like nervous that I would get pulled over.
Yeah.
And so I stopped and spent an extra 3 hours just getting my tags updated before I made the long drive down here. And part of it was because as Black women, when their Black men go out, whether sons or brothers or husbands or what have you, there's this burden of concern.
Yes.
And then for us as Black men, there's always this burden of being perceived as a threat.
Yes.
And that's what, for me, really stuck out about Trayvon Martin, is because he was a Black teen in a hoodie in this neighborhood where this man thought he wasn't supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt it. I felt it viscerally.
Yeah. Yeah. What was your Christian response to Trayvon? Do you look back on your Christian response to Trayvon and believe it was actually Christian? Because I look back on my response to Trayvon and don't think that it reflects the gospel. I felt like I was extremely callous. I felt like I was ashamed, secondhand embarrassment.
Yeah.
They found this kid's Twitter account.
What was your response?
Well, my response was that, it was along the lines. One of the most dangerous things and elements we actually don't talk about in urban youth work and ministry, even in social work sometimes, is how familiarity with Black teenagers can lead to contempt for Black teenagers.
What? Wow.
And how in service and in teaching and in raising and in building, it can actually create within it a sense of resentment and a sense of angst and a sense of frustration and even a sense of bitterness towards Black teens. And so I think for me, I had youth ministry was so hard and it was so difficult. And I understood so little about myself as a Black man at that time.
Right.
And I had not done the work to understand myself. We did all the cool stuff, and I'm not saying it was a total wash and there was no good that came out of it. There's a lot of good that came out of it. But what I also recognize is that when the persistence of whoever you're serving doesn't receive and affirm you're serving, an insecure and immature person takes that and internalizes that. And then in that internalization imports that into all Black. Well, this is the problem with. And at that time, I was coming out of a very raw right-wing conservatism.
Yeah.
And I was realizing, it gets reckless here racially.
Right.
And I was recognizing all of that. And I was seeing that. And my eyes were being open. But I could not import that same grace toward Trayvon and toward Sabrina Fulton's mother. And toward I couldn't give them that same grace. And I couldn't give them that same mercy. And also couldn't even understand that he wasn't doing anything wrong.
Right, exactly.
I didn't even understand. Like and so there was a lack of empathy. There was also I think an exceptionalism that I had to repent for, that being a Black man in white space meant that, or being a Black man around in proximity to white spaces, even if you weren't directly in white spaces, it means that you're seen as hope for unity.
Right.
And you were talking about reconciliation. It just felt like you were hope for unity, hope for reconciliation. And so people leaned upon you and you wanted to keep that spot. Even if that wasn't your church, you still wanted to keep that spot and keep that status. So now I look back on it with shame, because what should have woken me up was actually something that I didn't pay attention to.
Well, we were new to it. I mean, like you said, this was kind of the first of these kinds of moments that we shared nationally and on social media together. So I remember not quite knowing how to react or how to feel. Whereas today, something like this happens, I know immediately, righteous anger,
exactly,
and
what to do, how to do it,
the life and the dignity of the individuals involved. But back then, I was also on the tip of, I had just finished being a middle school principal, and we were a college prep school. So it was about uniforms, tucking in your shirt, wearing the belt.
Respectability.
Yeah, in the most negative sense, right? Like you had to conform or assimilate in some way in order to get what we put forward as success.
Right.
And so from that standpoint, I'm like, well, why don't Black teens just do X, Y, Z, right? But in that moment, really though, I mean, for me, it was an eye-opening experience that unity that evangelicals have been talking about was a false unity. So it was like a punch in the gut and a slap in the face all at the same time. It was a revelation, and it was a sense of betrayal as well, because I'm dedicating all my life and energy to this. So we had started the African American Leadership Initiative, ran, like I said, I was at this multiracial, like I was all in.
You're doing everything you were supposed to be
waving the banner for the PCA, for Reformed theology. And here is this clear tragedy.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, all the comments start coming.
Yeah.
And then by these leaders, these evangelical leaders, these Reformed leaders who have books out and videos out in large churches, and they're responding with callousness toward it.
I'll never forget.
Like, what's happening?
I'll never forget. It was a pastor, and this was the first moment where I tilted my head to the side. And I had done that a couple of times throughout some of the responses that I was hearing from people, because it seemed unnecessarily aggressive from white Christians. And even me back then, where I was like, I don't think he's guilty, but I was like, just kind of weird. Like, why would you say that about, black people, And so I saw this Reformed pastor who was actually right near Sanford. And he said something to the effect of, on Twitter, we're not going to say anything about the verdict on Sunday, but we will say a lot about the gospel of Jesus. Like it was some that was a flex. Like that was a flex. And I was like, I don't know about that. Is there a space where we can actually engage with this? And even in my I was like, I don't know about that. Like that don't sound right. Yeah, that don't hit right. Exactly. And actually, really and truly, the response by white Christians to the acquittal, Reformed white Christians in particular, to the acquittal and the not guilty verdict of George Zimmerman, was actually a seed that led me to do some deeper research. And actually through that research is where I discovered James Cone. That was the first time I'd actually discovered James Cone a few months after that. Wow. And so it's wild. I don't know how I got there, but I'm just I end up seeing James Cone, and seeing James Cone helped me to see that in 2014, when, the Reformed response was similar
to Mike Brown,
black evangelical, Reformed apologists like Vodi Bakum say that it was Mike Brown's fault. Bro. Well, no, I can say,
say he reaped what he sowed.
He reaped what he sowed, I mean, so now I can see through that. Right.
It was traced back to Trayvon.
It was traced back to Trayvon. It woke me up, but in a way.
Woke.
Yeah. Anyway, but it helped me to it helped me to come to realization. Okay, they're gonna use that clip. See, he said it. He said it. Oh, yeah. It woke me up. Say whatever you want to say. I'm already been on woke preacher clips. It is what it is. It woke me up in the way that I feel like.
That's right. That's right.
I needed to be.
That's what's so critical about Trayvon Martin's terrible, tragic murder. And for me, and y'all mark it here and tag us, or at least me. I don't want to get you involved in trouble.
What you about to say?
I'm just saying what I've already told you.
Okay, got you.
This is the unraveling. If we had to pick one chronological moment to point to, I think the murder of Trayvon Martin would be the moment we point to as the beginning of the end of the evangelical racial reconciliation project.
And okay, let's stay there. And let's take a quick break. We need to breathe. Let's take a quick break because we're about to go off. Let's take a quick break. We need to breathe. And then we'll be right back here on Pass the Mic.
Our past is full of untold stories, untold joys, untold triumphs, untold victory, untold defeat. Behind every picture is an untold story of rejoicing, of fear, of attainment, of failure. We often focus on the exceptional achievements of exceptional people. But what if we started to see Black history as the everyday accomplishments of regular people? What if we took our heroes off a pedestal and looked at them like ordinary folks? Our history is more than trivia about our accomplishments. Each generation breaks boundaries as they are pushed forward by those who came before. Our past is full of untold stories, but we will tell them.
Jay, you were talking about the end, or the marking of the beginning of the end of this racial reconciliation project. And it's so wild to think that we really believed in the early to mid 2000s, from 2000 to really 2010. I mean, even going back, Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes does a tremendous job of tracking the Promise Keepers movement. You know, in her book, I bring the voices of my people, and it's wild to think how sold out we were about racial reconciliation, or as at that time John Piper was saying, racial harmony.
Right.
And, you know, we had no concept of solidarity, of justice.
Yes.
It was all racial reconciliation based upon, quote unquote, the gospel.
Right.
Whoever defined it as, or the purity of the gospel, which seemed to always exclude those people who have been doing justice work, and seemed to always keep away those people who have been actually working towards correcting the injustice and disunity that existed in society.
Right. Right.
And so what provoked that? When did you know that was it? When did you know that, it's about to break open?
Yeah, I don't think I knew quite at that moment, but I could feel it in me. My confidence and hope in this racial reconciliation project was fading.
Right.
Very quickly. And it was a combination of things, right? So it was Trayvon Martin's murder. It was the acquittal. It was the reaction of white evangelicals. It's also me in the seminary, in the church, in these spaces where I'm trying to do this work and discovering that it's controversial.
Right.
I remember it was the first presentation I gave on like race and justice from a Reformed and evangelical perspective. It was at the national conference, one of the breakout sessions. And I remember it was so nerve-wracking to prepare because I needed to feel like I had proactively addressed every possible objection that white folks would bring. And it was starting to have that sense that if I talk about this like I think it needs to be talked about, I'm going to take shots.
Absolutely.
And so that was, and then this apocalyptic revelation that you get it in blog posts and comments on social media of how white evangelicals and Reformed folks really, really feel about black people, and not just about the, oh, but not you kind of black people in their spaces.
It
you know
leaped
what I mean?
out. It leaped out.
So I didn't know that it was crumbling really
Exaggerated swagger. Anyway.
I didn't know that it was crumbling really till Mike Brown and the uprisings around that. Yeah. But the rumblings, I think, could be felt all the way back in 2012.
I think what really was visceral to me now, looking back on what I saw from Black community, is many of us in our expression that I was watching were bemoaning and disheartened and heartbroken at the fact that this was a boy. You know, this is a teenager, just a kid.
Yeah. You know,
it doesn't matter how tall he was, doesn't matter how big he was, doesn't matter any of that. He was a kid. You know, and as a kid, I think it's just so striking how callous people are to Black children, and how little grace and mercy and how little consideration and empathy they have for the Black experience in a child's body.
Yeah.
And seeing his mother's tears and his father's tears, beyond all the racial reconciliation stuff that we talk about, or justice, or all these things, a mother lost a son.
Yeah.
A father lost a son. And thinking about who Trayvon Martin could have become, like, that's one of the things that I think now, 10 years after, I'm saying, who could Trayvon have become?
He'd be 27.
Who could Mike Brown have become? Who could Tamir Rice have become? And their bodies were taken from us without redress, without consequence, with no opposition. The state said it was okay.
No one's responsible.
No one's accountable. No one's responsible. Who could Ahmaud Arbery have become? You know, when Breonna Taylor typed on Twitter that she was excited about the new year, the same year that would cost her life, that would take her life. And that's the presence of the most amount of regret and shame as it relates to these situations, is that we miss the opportunity to sit and mourn the loss of a dream within the body and the loss of a story and the abrupt end when more life wasn't just possible, but was necessary to complete their arc.
Right.
And I think about how many people talk to me and I'm friends with who are much older than me and who say, yeah, when I was 17, I was wilding out. Or when I was 17, I was just doing stuff I didn't know what I wanted to be.
Right.
It's not even to say Trayvon Martin was wilding out. He was just
on
just
his
a
way
kid.
back from the convenience store.
He was just a kid. Like, man, I was just living, just saying, hey, I was a kid. I didn't know who I wanted to be, what I wanted to become, who I could become. But what I do know is I had the opportunity to find my purpose.
Right.
And in my living, I found that,
And we would be mistaken. I mean, we often try to make meaning of these senseless murders, right? Yeah. And say, well, it's a tragedy, but his death kind of awakened the movement, right? Y'all, we shouldn't need Black death to arouse our consciences.
Yeah. That's unnecessary.
Trayvon Martin should still be alive.
He should still be here.
And it shouldn't take the blood of Black children to remind us of the dignity of Black people.
Yes.
That should be a given. That is what justice looks like, where we recognize in every body, the identity, the dignity, the image, and the likeness of being made in God's image. I wouldn't have been able to articulate any of that at that point. Yes. But there was something visceral,
Absolutely.
And as a result of all of this, here we are now. So we've transitioned. I use the words racial justice rather than racial reconciliation.
Right.
It was a big part of our story in becoming the witness, a big part of what shaped the themes and the focus of this podcast, Pass the Mic, and more nationally, broadly, a big part of the momentum and the push and also the pushback to change the state of race relations today. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize Trayvon Martin as a human being, as an individual, as a young Black boy, recognize the sorrow and the pain of his family and friends who still are aching and feeling that hole and that loss, and recognize what his death, what the acquittal, what all of that meant for who we are as a nation and who we ought to be.
Yes. Yeah. Rest in power, Trayvon Martin.
We hold space for you, brother.